I kept hearing the Admiral's words, spoken clearly and calmly in a way I couldn't forget. "Your jacket," he'd said. "It's in my house." For a moment, I was sure I'd heard him wrong. The room was full of officers standing at attention, and the only sound was the whir of the heater. He looked directly at me. His eyes were sharp, but not angry, almost like he knew something I didn't. My hands were shaking a little where they rested at my sides, but I kept my position, staring straight ahead while my heart beat hard against my ribs. That whole situation didn't start in the inspection room, though. It began a week before, during a storm that seemed like it wanted to wipe the whole area off the map. I was on supply duty near Kodiak, and it was freezing. It was the kind of cold that went right through my gloves and made the sky look like a sheet of metal. The roads were dangerously slick, and my breath fogged up the cab. We'd all been on double shifts for 2 weeks, just running supplies between the base and the civilian depots. I pulled into a little general store on the edge of town. It was one of those old Alaskan buildings with wood siding and a sign that was half hidden by a snowdrift. I just wanted a quick cup of coffee, probably burnt, and 5 minutes out of the wind before I had to head back. As I got out of the truck, I saw them, a boy maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing outside with a woman who looked exhausted. Her coat was way too thin for the weather. The boy's lips had a bluish tint, and he was shivering, his small hands pushed up into his sleeves. "Ma'am, are you two okay?" I asked, my voice muffled by my scarf. She nodded really fast, looking embarrassed. "We're fine, just waiting for my brother." She said his truck broke down, but I had a feeling she wasn't telling the truth. Their old car had frost building up on the inside of the windows, which only happens when you've been sitting without heat for a long time. Inside, I bought my coffee and a sandwich. When I came back out, the woman was brushing snow out of the boy's hair, whispering that it would just be a few more minutes. I just stood there for a second, the steam from my coffee disappearing in the wind, feeling the cold find its way through the collar of my jacket. I'm not sure why I did it. I just walked over to them, unbuttoned my navy jacket, and knelt in front of the boy. "Here, Sayanita. Here," I said, putting it over his shoulders. "Keep this zipped up, it'll block the wind." His eyes got wide. They were that clear, bright blue kids have. "But it's yours," he said, his voice shaky. "It's just a jacket," I told him, trying to smile. "Stay warm, sailor." His mother's eyes immediately filled with tears. "Ma'am, we can't—" "Don't worry about it," I interrupted gently. I've got another one." That was a lie. It was my only issued coat, the one with my name tag, Mason, sewn on it. But it felt like the right thing to do. So I gave it to him, walked back to my truck, and drove off into the gray afternoon. By the time I got back to the base, the storm was a total whiteout. My boots were soaked, and the truck's heater had given up halfway back. I signed in at the checkpoint, and the guard gave me a confused look. "Commander, where's your jacket?" "Loaned it to someone who needed it more. Satin," I said. He grinned, like he thought I was making a joke. That night, I sat in the barracks with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, trying to get warm. I thought about that boy's face, especially the look he gave me when I zipped up the jacket. I figured that was the end of it. Just a small, quiet act of kindness during a long winter. But the Navy doesn't really work that way. Small things can sometimes echo all the way up the chain of command, and sometimes they come back much louder than you'd ever expect. A week later, the announcement came over the base PA system. "All personnel, full uniform inspection. Admiral Vance will be visiting from the Pacific Fleet." I groaned. High-level inspections were never good news. It meant every single detail had to be perfect, from the shine on your belt buckle to making sure your ribbons were aligned to the millimeter. I spent that night pressing a coat I'd borrowed, checking every seam and hoping nobody would notice it didn't quite fit me right. The next morning, the Admiral arrived. He wasn't someone you'd forget. He was tall, with silver hair, and a presence that just radiated years of command. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make everyone in the room stand up straighter. He walked down the line of officers, stopping in front of each one, saying a few quiet words, and then moving on. When he got to me, his boots stopped just inches from mine. I kept my eyes focused forward, but my heart was hammering so hard I was afraid he could hear it. He studied me for a long time, and then he spoke, his voice quiet, almost personal. "Lieutenant Commander Mason?" "Yes, sir." His gaze never left my face. "Your jacket, it's in my house." A few officers nearby glanced over, looking confused. My throat felt tight. Sir? He gave a very faint smile. We'll talk later. Then he just moved down the line. I stood there, completely still, feeling my face flush with heat even in that cold hangar. My mind was racing. How could the admiral of all people have my jacket? When the inspection was finally over, my senior officer whispered, "What was that about?" I had no answer for him. Only one thought kept circling in my head. The boy. Something in my gut told me this story wasn't over. The rest of that day felt longer than any mission I'd ever been on. Every time I walked across the base, it felt like I was moving through a fog. Not the cold, biting kind, but the kind that gets in your head and makes everything feel unreal. I kept replaying what Admiral Vance had said. Your jacket, it's in my house. It hadn't sounded like a threat. He wasn't angry. If anything, his voice had a quiet warmth to it, which honestly made me more nervous. Admirals don't usually speak warmly to junior officers, especially not in an inspection line. Still, the rumor mill started up before lunch. By the afternoon, half the logistics division had a different theory. Heard the admiral knows her family. No, she's related to someone in Fleet Command. My favorite one was, she's getting promoted for rescuing a cat while in uniform. The Navy gossip chain could move faster than ammunition. That evening, I was in the warehouse checking inventory when I got a call from the base adjutant. Lieutenant Commander Mason, report to Admiral Vance's office at 1900 hours. My hand froze halfway through signing a clipboard. I had never in my entire career been summoned to an admiral's private quarters. When I got there, the Marine standing guard outside his door gave me a sympathetic look, like he already knew this was going to be a meeting I wouldn't forget. I took a deep breath, fixed my collar, and knocked. Come in. The Admiral's office wasn't like the other command rooms. There were no steel desks or harsh fluorescent lights. It looked more like a comfortable study, lined with old maps, a model of a destroyer, and framed photos of his family in uniform. There was a faint smell of old leather and pipe tobacco in the air. Admiral Vance was standing by the window, his hands behind his back, just looking out at the snow that was still falling over the lights on the pier. Commander Mason, he said without turning around. Thank you for coming, sir, I said, standing at attention. He finally turned. He had that same look from the inspection, calm, observant, like he could see the whole picture before anyone else. He motioned to a chair. At ease. Sit down. That one command felt strange. Admirals didn't usually ask. They ordered. I sat down, not sure what to do with my hands. He leaned against his desk, crossed his arms, and said quietly, A week ago, during that blizzard, you stopped at a small store off Route 9, is that correct? Yes, sir. You gave your issued Navy jacket to a child there. Yes, sir. He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something he already knew. Then he stepped behind his desk and picked up a small object. It was a folded piece of dark blue fabric with a familiar gold name tag, Mason. My breath caught. Sir, how... He smiled just faintly. My grandson Leo came home wearing it. It took a full second for his words to register. My mind flashed back to the boy's face, the blue eyes, the shivering hands, the way his mother had looked at me like I'd just saved her entire world. The Admiral continued, his voice low and steady. That night, he wandered away from our cabin after a small argument. My daughter was frantic. By the time we found him, the only thing keeping him from freezing was this. He laid the jacket down gently on the desk. He told us a Navy lady gave it to him, said you called him Sailor. My throat felt tight. Sir, I didn't know. Of course you didn't, he interrupted, his voice soft. You just did what a good officer does. You saw someone who was cold and you acted. He studied me again for a longer time, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. You reminded me that our service doesn't end at the base gate. My family owes you more than we can say. I was speechless. Words just felt too small for the moment. I wanted to tell him I didn't deserve any thanks, that anyone in uniform would have done the same thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have stopped. After a pause, he gestured to a framed photo on his shelf. It was him with a woman and 2 children, standing in front of a naval cruiser. "That's my daughter, Captain Julia Vance, Leo's mother. She asked to meet you when she visits the base next week." I hesitated. "Sir, that's not necessary." He shook his head. "It's already arranged." Then, as if he was shifting the mood, he walked back around the desk and said with a small grin, "You can't wear that jacket anymore. Security will issue you a new one." That was the first time I'd ever seen a 4-star admiral smile like a father. When I left his office, the hallway seemed brighter, even under the dim nightlights. I walked outside and the cold air hit me, feeling like the first deep breath you take after a storm has passed. It wasn't about the jacket. It wasn't even about the gratitude. It was something deeper, a reminder that sometimes simple kindness is more important than command. I thought that would be the end of the story. But that night at dinner in the mess hall, Commander Thorne sat down across from me with a smirk that just rubbed me the wrong way. Thorne had been in logistics forever. He was ambitious, sharp, and he was the kind of officer who definitely remembered any promotion he didn't get. He'd been passed over for one that I got last year, and he'd been almost too polite to me ever since. "Word travels fast," he said, cutting into his food. "The Admiral's little hero, huh? That'll probably look good on your next evaluation." "It's not like that," I said, keeping my voice level. "It was just a kid." "Sure," he said, smiling but not looking at me. "Just a kid. But you know how stories get passed around here. Be careful, Mason. The Navy loves heroes, right up until they don't." His tone was casual, but the warning felt real. Thorne didn't like being in second place. I put my fork down. "I didn't ask for any attention, Commander." "I know," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "But you got it anyway." He smiled again, a thin, practiced smile that held something colder than the Kodiak wind. That night, lying in my bunk, I tried to ignore it. The Admiral's kindness and his family's gratitude should have been the end of it, but I could feel something changing. A kind act can draw attention, but in a place like the Navy, that kind of attention can also make you a target. When Captain Julia Vance arrived the following week, the whole base seemed to stand a little taller. Everyone knew who she was. The Admiral's daughter and a decorated officer herself. She was the kind of leader whose name carried weight. I'd seen her in command briefings before, but never this close. She had a steady, confident presence, like someone who had spent her whole life balancing her family and her service. I wasn't nervous about meeting her, not until I saw the boy step out of the SUV with her. It was Leo, the same blue-eyed kid who had been shivering outside the store. This time he looked warm and healthy, with that kind of brightness you see in a kid who's been given a second chance. "Lieutenant Commander Mason," she said, holding out her hand. "I'm Julia Vance. I believe you've already met my son." I stood at attention, then shook her hand. "Ma'am, I'm just glad he's all right." She smiled softly. "You saved him that night. We might not have found him in time if it weren't for your jacket." Then she looked down at Leo. "Go ahead, sweetheart." The boy stepped forward, holding something folded neatly in his hands. It was my Navy jacket, cleaned and pressed, with the name tag still intact. "I thought you'd want it back," he said quietly. I knelt to his eye level. "You kept it safe for me. That means more than you know." He grinned, and for the first time, I felt something inside me relax. It was that quiet relief you feel when you realize the world still works the way it's supposed to. After that meeting, life seemed to get back to normal, at least on the surface. I went back to my usual routine: inventory counts, requisition forms, fuel manifests. But there was a definite undercurrent now. The way people on base looked at me had changed. Some officers would nod with respect, almost with pride. Others would whisper when I walked by. In military life, goodwill can turn into suspicion very quickly, and no one seemed to be carrying that suspicion more than Commander Thorne. He stopped by the supply hangar a couple of days later, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting crates like he was looking for a problem. "Nice commendation from the Admiral," he said casually. "Are you planning to go into humanitarian work full-time, or are you still in logistics?" I kept my tone professional. "Just doing my job, sir." He smirked. Sure, it's funny how doing your job can look a lot like showing off to the right people. That was the first time I realized he wasn't just bitter, he was jealous. He was jealous of the attention and jealous that something I did without thinking had earned me the kind of recognition he couldn't get, no matter how many reports he filed. A few days later, Captain Vance invited me to have dinner with her and the admiral's family. I hesitated. The rules about fraternization were tricky, and being seen as too close to high command could create enemies. But she insisted, saying it was informal, just their way of saying thank you. Their house was just outside the base, a modest, weather-beaten place overlooking the water. It wasn't flashy at all. Inside, it felt warm and lived in. Family photos were on the walls showing generations in service uniforms alongside medals and a few drawings that were clearly Leo's. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, potatoes, and a lot of laughter that didn't sound forced. The Admiral wasn't the serious man from the inspection. He laughed when his wife teased him about forgetting his own birthday, and his grandson held onto his arm like he was the center of the world. It felt strange to be there. For so many years, my life had been about schedules, reports, and following orders. I'd forgotten what a normal family dinner sounded like. At one point, Ms. Vance put her hand on mine. "Rebecca," she said, "my husband spent 40 years teaching officers to lead with strength. You reminded him and all of us that strength can also be quiet." I smiled, not really sure what to say. Compliments in the Navy were usually about adequate performance or satisfactory discipline. Warmth was rare, but that warmth wasn't going to last. The next morning, I got back to base and found an email from the Office of Command Integrity. The subject line was, "Supply audit irregularities detected." It requested my immediate cooperation regarding missing fuel reports from the Kodiak station. My stomach dropped. I scrolled down. The flagged entries were all under my name: falsified numbers, unauthorized fuel transfers, and dates, when I knew for a fact I hadn't even been on duty. I reread the message 3 times. Sure, it had to be a mistake. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. Someone had gone into the logs and changed my entries. There were only 2 people with access to that system: me and Commander Thorne. That afternoon, Thorne walked into my office, crossed his arms, and had that sharp smile on his face. "Heard Command Integrity is asking questions," he said, his voice light. "That's a rough way to start the week." "Don't play dumb, Thorne," I snapped. "You know I didn't touch those records." He just shrugged. "Relax, Mason. I'm sure it's just a clerical error. These things usually sort themselves out." Then he leaned in a little, lowering his voice. "Though I have to say, it's pretty ironic. You saved the Admiral's grandson, and a week later you're stealing fuel from him. Life's funny that way." Before I could even think of a reply, he turned and walked out, leaving just the smell of coffee and his own arrogance behind. That night, I sat on the edge of my bunk, staring at the folded jacket hanging in my locker, the one Leo had returned. The gold letters of my name, Mason, seemed to catch the dim light. For years, I'd believed that service was about discipline. You follow the rules, you do the work, and justice takes care of itself. But sitting there in that cold room, I realized that sometimes doing the right thing just paints a target on your back. Still, I couldn't be angry at the Admiral or his family. They hadn't done anything wrong. The anger I felt was all for Thorne, the kind of man who would twist a good deed into a weapon. And even then, I wasn't thinking about revenge. Not yet. Back then, all I wanted was the truth. Clean, simple, and undeniable. The storm outside picked up again that night. Snow whipped against the window and the wind howled. Somewhere out there, a family was warm because I'd given something away. And inside, I was shivering, wondering if I was about to lose everything for that same reason. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I just saw numbers, forms, and signatures, like lines of data flashing red. I kept going over every log entry in my head, trying to figure out when or how it could have happened. But it didn't matter how many times I rechecked. The falsified records all led back to my name. By morning, the base felt even colder. It wasn't just the weather, though the snow was still coming down. It was the way people looked at me. A few officers who usually nodded just looked away. Conversations stopped when I walked into a room. The Navy is a small world, and bad rumors travel fast. At 0900, I was ordered to report to the administrative office. When I walked in, the atmosphere was heavy. Commander Thorne was sitting at the conference table next to a pair of officers from Command Integrity. He smiled faintly when he saw me, that practiced political smile that hides what's really underneath. "Lieutenant Commander Mason," said the officer in charge, a man named Brandt. "We've received an anonymous report regarding irregularities in your supply records." "Anonymous?" I repeated, taking the seat across from him. "Whoever wrote it was wrong." Brandt's expression didn't change. "That may be, but our initial review found discrepancies in your requisition forms and fuel distribution logs. Specifically, over 800 gallons of fuel are unaccounted for between January 5th and 8th. "That's impossible," I said. "Those logs were verified by both me and Commander Thorne." Brandt glanced at Thorne, who just shrugged innocently. "We'll verify that during the review," Brandt said. "In the meantime, your promotion evaluation will be paused until we conclude this investigation." By the time the meeting was over, my stomach felt like it was full of lead. I left without saying another word. Outside, the wind was tearing across the runway, swirling snow around my boots as if the world was trying to bury me. Back in the barracks, I just sat staring at my locker. The jacket Leo had returned was hanging neatly inside. Its gold tag caught the dim light. One day it had looked like a symbol of pride. Now it just reminded me of how fragile that pride really was. When I joined the Navy, I believed that integrity was like a shield. If you do your duty and keep your record clean, the truth will protect you. But standing there, I started to understand something it's harder. Sometimes the truth is the last thing anyone wants to hear. The investigation dragged on for weeks. I wasn't arrested, but the damage was already happening. My assignments got lighter. People started avoiding eye contact. A few even quietly asked me what really happened. I kept working, checking inventory and writing reports, but every signature I wrote felt like a risk. Thorne, meanwhile, seemed to get friendlier, almost smug. He'd clap me on the shoulder in the mess hall, smiling for everyone else to see, but his eyes said something different. They said, "I've got you." One evening after the warehouse was closed, I caught him in the hallway. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. He stopped and tilted his head, that faint smirk still on his face. "Doing what?" "Framing me. You think no one sees it, but I know you doctored those logs." Thorne leaned closer. His breath smelled faintly of bourbon. "Careful, Mason. Accusing a superior officer without proof isn't a good look. You don't want to dig this hole any deeper." "The truth has a way of coming out," I said. "Sure," he replied, stepping back, "but by the time it does, no one will care." He left me standing there with only the hum of the base generators filling the silence. I wanted to yell, to hit something, to demand justice. But rage doesn't fit well inside a uniform. The Navy teaches you to hold the line, not to break it. A week later, I was called to the admiral's office again. My hands were shaking when I saluted. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "you've served this command well, but there's pressure from above. Until this inquiry is complete, I have no choice but to suspend you from active duty." It felt like being punched. "Sir, with all respect, I didn't falsify anything." He sighed. "I believe you, but right now this isn't about belief. It's about protocol. I will make sure the process is fair." His eyes looked genuinely sorry, and that almost made it worse. He was one of the few who still believed me, but even an admiral had to follow the rules. When I stepped outside, the base looked smaller than it ever had before. The sky was gray, the snow was turning to slush, and the wind cut right through my borrowed coat. I walked to the end of the pier, watching the ocean heave below, and thought about all the years I'd given to this uniform. Service wasn't supposed to feel like being exiled. That night, I called my father. We hadn't spoken in a few months. He's a retired foreman from a shipyard in Virginia, a tough man, proud but with very simple morals. He answered on the second ring. "Rebecca, you still alive up there?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a small laugh. "Barely." We talked for a while about the weather, the kind of small talk you make when you don't know how to start a real conversation. Then I told him what was happening. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You remember what I told you when you joined?" I smiled bitterly. That the Navy would eat me alive? "No," he said. "That the Navy would test you. And when it does, you'll find out who you really are." I didn't answer. "You did the right thing for that boy," he continued. "Don't let someone else's lie make you forget that." His voice cracked just a little. "You can lose your rank, you can lose your title, but you can't lose your honor. That's yours to keep." When we hung up, I sat in the silence. The old man didn't say much, but his words grounded me more than any medal or order ever had. By morning, I decided I wasn't going to hide. If Thorne wanted to destroy my career, he was going to have to do it out in the open. I went back to work, even with my suspension papers pending, and finished every task I could. I signed forms, double-checked manifests, and kept my head held high. And in that quiet moment before the real storm hit, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to fight him with anger. I was going to fight him with proof. I didn't know it yet, but that proof was already on its way, and it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from a voice I hadn't heard since that snowy night. Suspension felt like being punished for a crime I didn't commit. My days became long and quiet, filled with paperwork that probably no one would ever read. The uniform I used to wear with pride was now hanging in my locker, untouched, like it belonged to someone else. But duty is a habit you don't just break. I still reported to the warehouse, helping the enlisted staff organize crates and maintenance supplies. Technically, I wasn't supposed to be there, but I couldn't just sit in my quarters and wait for my reputation to be ruined. It was late one night when I saw Sal, one of the base custodians. He was a man in his 60s with leathery hands and a slight limp from an old injury. He'd been working on Navy bases longer than I'd been alive. He was always quiet, just pushing his mop down the long hallways, giving a polite nod to everyone, but almost never talking. That night, I found him sweeping the hallway corner near the fuel office, which is where most of the logs were kept. "Evening, Commander," he said, nodding respectfully. "You're burning the midnight oil again." "Couldn't sleep," I said, giving him a tired smile. "What's your excuse?" He chuckled. "Sleep is overrated once your knees start complaining louder than your conscience." I smiled a little, ready to walk on, but then he said something that made me stop. "You know, it's funny," he said quietly. "The other night I saw Commander Thorne hanging around here, long after everyone else had gone home. Must have been close to midnight. He had your file open on the computer terminal." My heart started to beat faster. "Are you sure about that?" Sal nodded slowly. "He looked jumpy, kept checking the hallway. I didn't think anything of it, not until I heard the rumors about you." I leaned against the wall, my breath visible in the cold air. "Would you be willing to repeat that?" He frowned. "If it clears your name, yeah, a man like him gives the Navy a bad name. We didn't serve all these years just to see good officers get buried by cowards." For the first time in weeks, I felt something that resembled hope. The next morning, I wrote a formal statement summarizing everything Sal had seen. I knew it wasn't solid proof by itself, but it was the first real crack in Thorne's story. Meanwhile, I heard through one of the junior officers that the admiral's family had found out about my suspension. Apparently, Leo had asked his mother why the lady with the jacket wasn't coming to dinner anymore. The story must have gotten back to the admiral because 2 days later, I received a sealed message. "Report to command office, confidential meeting." When I got there, Admiral Vance was standing near his desk, reading something. He didn't look up until I saluted. "At ease," he said. "We've received conflicting statements regarding your case. You will be notified of a hearing date." "Yes, sir." He studied me for a long moment. "I read your service record again last night. There isn't a single blemish in 10 years. That has to count for something." "Thank you, Admiral." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "You know, my grandson still prays for you every night. He says you're the reason he's not afraid of the dark anymore." That caught me off guard. After all the stress I'd been under, that one sentence cut through all the noise. "Tell him," I said softly, "that his courage that night was all his own." The Admiral nodded, but his eyes said more than his words. Something in his mind had already shifted. Later that week, as the snow on the base finally started to melt into slush, Sal's statement was officially filed. The Integrity Office reopened the investigation. I wasn't told any of the details, but the whispers started to change. The forensic techs had apparently found evidence that the logs were accessed using Thorne's credentials. Thorne stopped speaking to me after that, but I could feel the tension in every hallway. He walked faster, barked his orders louder, and pointedly avoided my eyes. One evening, I passed him outside the officer's quarters. He was just staring at the horizon. His tone was almost casual. "You really think this is going to end well for you, Mason?" "I don't have to think," I said. "I just have to tell the truth." He smirked. "Truth is just another tool, Lieutenant. You'll learn that when it stops working for you." "Maybe," I said quietly. "But I'd rather lose with it than win without it." He didn't answer. He just walked away, his shoulders stiff, as if the cold air itself was mocking him. Days passed. Then, one morning, a courier brought a plain, confidential envelope to my quarters. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A formal hearing was scheduled. Evidence had been submitted. All officers were to appear. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time, it wasn't fear keeping me awake. It was clarity. The Navy had taught me discipline, but that act of kindness had taught me something stronger: the power of quiet persistence. I remembered my father's voice. "You can't lose your honor. That's yours to keep." I wasn't sure if this hearing would save my career, but I knew one thing. Thorne had built his career on lies, and lies always leave fingerprints. As the sun came up over the icy harbor, I walked toward the hangar. The light on the water looked softer that morning, like the world was finally thawing out. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was waking up, too. The day of the hearing was gray and still. It was the kind of morning where the sea and the sky just blend into one sheet of steel. I stood outside the administrative building, my gloved hands clasped behind my back, waiting for my name to be called. The wind whipped across the base flagpole, making the flag snap sharply in the air. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. When you've already lost everything that can be taken from you, fear doesn't have much left to hold on to. Inside the hearing room, a long table separated us. On one side sat the Board of Inquiry, 3 senior officers and a legal advisor. At the head of the table sat Admiral Vance. His expression was impossible to read. His eyes were cool and distant. On the other side sat Commander Thorne, his uniform perfectly crisp, his shoes polished like mirrors, his posture looking rehearsed. I took my seat in silence. The only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. The lead officer, Captain Pierce, started reading the charges. "Falsification of supply records, breach of command integrity, conduct unbecoming of an officer." The words just rolled out like distant thunder. "Lieutenant Commander Mason," Pierce said, "you may begin your defense." I stood up, placing my palms flat on the table. "With respect, sir, I have never falsified a single record in my service. My reputation and performance are documented through 10 years of active duty. I've dedicated my career to this command, and I can prove I'm innocent." Thorne leaned back in his chair slightly, pretending to be bored. "That's a strong statement," he said, his voice smooth. "The truth usually is," I replied. The board reviewed the digital logs. Thorne explained that I had been the only officer authorized to finalize the transactions during that specific week. Therefore, the missing fuel was clearly my responsibility. His tone was calm, almost friendly, as if this were just a training exercise and not an accusation that could end my career. "Why would I falsify those records?" I asked. "There's no motive. There's no gain. My record speaks for itself." Thorne smiled faintly. "You tell me, Mason. Maybe a little side deal with the depot. You've always been generous. Giving away jackets? Maybe you're giving away supplies, too." That line stung more than I expected. The jab was subtle, but he did it on purpose, turning my act of kindness into a mockery. Before I could respond, Admiral Vance raised a hand. "Enough. Commander, keep this professional." Thorne gave a stiff salute, but I could see his jaw tighten. The hearing dragged on for over an hour. They went through every shipment, every signature, every timestamp. My mind kept drifting between the hearing room and that frozen night outside the store. The boy, the snow, the jacket. I wondered if that one act of compassion had cursed me, or if it was the only thing keeping me from losing myself completely. Then, halfway through, the adjutant entered the room quietly and handed the Admiral a sealed envelope. He opened it, scanned the pages, and looked up. Not at Thorne, but at me. Commander Thorne, he said evenly. When did you last access the base fuel database? Thorne blinked. Sir, I review it routinely. It's part of my oversight. Why? The Admiral nodded to Captain Pierce. Read it. Captain Pierce opened the document and started to read. Forensic analysis of the access logs confirms unauthorized modifications were made on January 7th, originating from Commander Thorne's credentials. We also have a supporting statement from Chief Maintenance Officer Sal Rossi, who witnessed Commander Thorne at the terminal after hours at 2310. The room became completely quiet. All the color drained from Thorne's face. This is absurd, he said quickly. That system is shared. Anyone could have... Enough. The Admiral's voice was sharp as ice. You accused one of my officers based on false information. You altered those records to sabotage a subordinate. Do you deny it? Thorne opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The room seemed to shrink around him. I stood quietly, my hands still clasped, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I just breathed slowly, letting the truth do what revenge never could. The Admiral turned toward me. Lieutenant Commander Mason, your record is hereby cleared. Effective immediately, your suspension is lifted and your name is restored. I saluted. Thank you, sir. My voice came out steady, even though I could feel tears stinging the backs of my eyes. Thorne was ordered to surrender his command, pending a disciplinary review. As he stood up, he shot me a look filled with cold anger, the kind of look a man gives when he's been defeated by his own weapon. He passed by me without a word. For once, silence felt like justice. When the board adjourned, I stepped outside into the pale afternoon light. The air smelled like salt and thawing ice. A faint breeze came off the harbor, carrying the cries of seagulls. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. Admiral Vance followed me out a moment later. He walked beside me in silence until we reached the edge of the pier. I owe you an apology, he said finally. You showed more composure while under attack than some admirals I've served with. That's not just strength, Lieutenant. That's character. Thank you, sir, I said quietly. He nodded toward the sides. Horizon. My father used to say, there's no revenge purer than the truth. He was right. I let his words sink in. The water shimmered under the sun, and for a second I thought of Leo, the boy in the snow. I thought about how a single act of kindness had spiraled into all of this. Permission to speak freely, sir? I asked. Always. I don't regret helping that boy, I said. Not even after everything that happened. The Admiral smiled faintly. I'd be disappointed if you did. We stood there for a while, just two officers looking out over the water. The silence between us felt more powerful than any ceremony. Then he turned to me. You've been recommended for reinstatement as operations officer. Congratulations, Commander. The title didn't matter as much as the tone he used when he said it. It was calm, respectful, and proud. As he walked away, I looked out at the horizon again. The snow had stopped. The sea, which had been so harsh and gray, was now glistening under a streak of sunlight. Justice hadn't come quickly or easily, but it had come. It was clean, quiet, and absolute. Spring arrived quietly in Kodiak. The air still had a chill, but the snow had finally melted off the runways, leaving puddles that reflected the sky. The gulls were back, circling over the docks where the sea met the horizon. The base, which had started to feel like a prison, now just hummed with a sense of calm. I had been fully reinstated for about a month when the Admiral invited me to dinner at his home. No uniform. Then uniform, his note had said. Just come as yourself. It was a Saturday evening. The dusk seemed to last for hours, painting everything in a golden light. I hesitated outside their door for a second. It was the same little house just outside the gates, with the same wooden steps and the same wind chimes rattling in the breeze. I'd been here before, once as a stranger accused of stealing, and now as something else. I still wasn't sure what. Mrs. Vance opened the door with a warm smile. Rebecca, she said, her voice full of kindness. Come in, dear. He's been waiting for you. The smell of home cooking drifted down the hallway. Roast chicken again. I could smell rosemary and butter, and I could hear laughter coming from the living room. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the floor, building a model ship, When he saw me, his face lit up. "Commander Mason!" he shouted, running over to hug me. "Look what I built!" I laughed, kneeling beside him. "That's a fine destroyer, sailor. You'll have my job in 10 years. He grinned proudly, and then I noticed what he was wearing. It was my Navy jacket. The sleeves were still a little long for him, but it was freshly cleaned, and the gold name tag glinted in the lamplight. The Admiral came into the room, walking a little slower than usual, a soft pride in his eyes. "He refuses to take that thing off," he said. "We've tried everything. He says it's lucky." Leo looked up. "It's not lucky, Grandpa. It's brave." Everyone laughed. Quietly, but in the Admiral's eyes, I saw that same deep gratitude that had been there since that first winter day. Over dinner, the conversation was easy. They asked about the base, about the new recruits, and about how I was settling back into my role. The Admiral teased his wife for burning the rolls. Leo told a story about trying to salute his teacher at school. And somewhere in that easy, normal rhythm, I realized something. I'd spent years believing the Navy was about rank, structure, and precision, about getting everything right. But sitting there, surrounded by warmth and laughter, I understood it was also about the things you can't measure: kindness, loyalty, and quiet courage. After dinner, we moved out to the porch. The sky was streaked with violet, and we could faintly hear the sound of the waves. The Admiral stood next to me, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know, and there's..." "No," he said. "I've commanded ships, fleets, and men across 3 oceans. But the thing I'll remember most from this winter isn't a mission or a medal." "What's that, sir?" He smiled. "A young officer who gave away her jacket without expecting anything in return. You reminded me that leadership isn't about control, it's about heart." We just stood there for a long moment. The wind brushed across the porch, cool but gentle, carrying the smell of salt and pine. "I thought about that hearing a lot," I admitted. "For a while I was angry, at Thorne, at the system, even at myself, but now I think maybe it happened the way it needed to." He nodded slowly. "You found out what kind of person you really are. Most people go their whole careers without ever learning that." I looked at him. "And what about Thorne?" "Dishonorably discharged," he said simply, "but the record will speak for itself. We don't need to speak of him anymore." There was no vengeance in his tone, just closure. It was clean and final. As the evening got darker, I got ready to leave. Mrs. Vance hugged me like I was family. Leo stood in the doorway, still wearing the jacket. "Keep it," I told him quietly. It suits you." He shook his head seriously. "No, ma'am. Grandpa says uniforms should stay where they belong." He carefully folded it, just like it would be in a locker, and placed it in my hands. "It's yours," he said, "but I'll remember." I knelt down, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "That's all I could ever ask for, sailor." On the drive back to the base, the roads were empty. The radio was playing some old country song about home and getting a second chance. I rolled the window down and let the cold air fill the truck. Somewhere along the coast, the clouds broke and a soft beam of moonlight cut through the mist. I thought about my father's words again. "You can lose your rank, your title, but not your honor." He'd been right. Honor wasn't something the Navy gave me. It was something I had to protect, even when the world tried to take it away. At the base gate, the guards saluted as I passed. Through. For once, I didn't feel like just another officer on the roster. I felt whole. I parked by the pier and stepped out, walking to the edge where the sea whispered against the dock. The water was calm, silver under the moonlight. I could see my reflection in it, tired, older maybe, but steady. I thought of Leo, of the Admiral, and of that first night when I'd handed over my jacket without a second thought. A small gesture, one I'd barely remembered at first, had become the thread that pulled everything together: compassion, truth, and justice. And maybe that's what life was really about. Not about the grand victories, but about the quiet acts that ripple outward until they reach someone who needs them.